What's going on, everybody? I'm Sega Lord X, and in this episode we are going to be looking at Sega Saturn horror themed games. Now, looking back at these games, it's hard to call 20-year-old games scary, because they're not really scary anymore, even if they were then. These games do contain common threads, however: suspense, drama, psychological elements. These games are all tied with common threads, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode. So, let's get right into horror-themed games on the Sega Saturn. In mid-1997, Capcom would bring the massive PlayStation 1 hit Resident Evil to the Sega Saturn. Coining the phrase survival horror, Resident Evil wouldn't be the first game of its type, but the refinements and level of production values bestowed by Capcom would make it one of the 32-bit era's most successful new franchises. You take the role of Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, members of a special tactics group sent in to investigate the mysterious happenings outside of Raccoon City. When things go wrong and your helicopter crashes, you must escape into a seemingly deserted mansion for safety. Little do you know that you just stepped into a world of hurt, full of zombies, killer biological weapons, and turncoat allies. You'll need to manage supplies intelligently to survive, and solve a few puzzles along the way. Resident Evil for me was an incredible experience beginning to end. Rarely did a game create such a perfect atmosphere to engross the player, driving you to explore and see where the next doorway led. Its near perfect balance of items versus the enemies meant you just couldn't go in and blast everything at will. Items and ammo needed to be used strategically, especially if you wanted the better endings, of which there were multiples. The Saturn port was solid, with a strong frame rate and decent textures. Character close-ups would reveal slightly muddled detail, and the pretty light sourcing and transparencies of the PlayStation 1 release would take hits as well. Capcom wouldn't let that stop them from making the Saturn version special, however, and they would add a battle mode that allowed you to play remixed areas of the game with different enemy placement. There would also be additional enemies in the game, including a second tyrant fight near the end of the game. Saturn exclusive outfits would also be available. The Japanese version of this game is quite playable, with a story spoken in English and is easy to follow with minimal guide help. It is also uncensored, something the Western releases would very much suffer from. No matter which version you own, however, Resident Evil on the Saturn is a top-notch game worthy of ownership. Its combination of atmosphere, intrigue, and masterful Japanese game design resulted in one of the best games of that era.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
You must be from the Bravo team.
Yes, I'm Rebecca Chambers. I'm a newcomer. I just joined the Stars Bravo team last month.
First released in Japan in mid-1995, D would be developed by Warp and published by Acclaim. This psychological horror game would use full motion video and pre-rendered gameplay segments to create one of the first games with real scare potential on a console. Ominous music, jump scares, disturbing imagery, and some rather adult themes would round out an incredibly important game to the horror genre on consoles. It's also one of the few games I played during the era that legitimately tried to make full motion video play like a real game. You take control of Laura, who is contacted by the police and told that her father has gone on a murder spree and barricaded himself in a hospital. You go to find your father, only to be sucked into a world of death and madness. There you will discover the truth about your family's origins and what has driven your father to madness. Graphics in this one have aged as expected, with grainy video making up the bulk of the presentation. Luckily, everything is still discernible and the environment is still able to retain some of its original creepiness. The audio presentation has fared better, and still has enough oomph to keep you engrossed in what's going on. Gameplay hooks center entirely around simplistic puzzles that lock away the next segment of the story. Thorough searches of your environment mean you almost can't fail as long as you think about every move. D's playability will almost certainly depend on your patience and tolerance for old technology, however, as this one is much slower and much less graphic than what you have access to today. Still, you can't deny its place in history, and this Saturn version remains playable even today. Sega would publish the blatant Resident Evil clone Deep Fear for the Saturn in both Europe and Japan in mid-1998. Our story centers around an underwater rescue attempt after things go horribly wrong while the Navy is attempting to study a crashed space capsule. Something aboard the vessel has begun to mutate humans into grotesque killing machines, and it's your job to kick their asses. Deep Fear would heavily borrow many elements from Resident Evil, including its multi-segmented camera angles, inventory management, poor voice acting, and tank-style gameplay. Despite these similarities in design, Deep Fear would also introduce some refinements of its own, the most significant being moving with your weapon drawn. Deep Fear would also capitalize on its underwater setting by making oxygen and breathing an important component of the gameplay. As the game progresses, the importance of oxygen becomes paramount, adding a layer of stress to the game that even Resident Evil doesn't have. This plays on the fear everyone can relate to, and forces you to consider your environment and inventory well beyond simply asking, do I have enough bullets for the next enemy? Graphically, the game looks and runs very nicely, and looks even better than the Saturn's Resident Evil port in many ways. The only outstanding flaws are some pacing issues with the story, and the cringeworthy voice acting that makes Resident Evil look like The Godfather. The European version of this game has skyrocketed in price, but fear not, as the Japanese version is extremely import friendly. The dialogue is in English, and many of the game's puzzles are simple enough to figure out on your own. I did get stuck a few times due to not knowing what to do next, but a quick peek at a walkthrough got me back on track in an instant. The story of this one doesn't quite grab you the way Resident Evil does, but it's still a good-looking and playing addition to the survival horror genre on the Saturn. It's a shame that Sega didn't continue this on the Dreamcast, something Sega fans have uttered far too often. In late 1996, Warp would release the Sega Saturn exclusive Enemy Zero. You are awakened aboard your space vessel by an emergency, only to watch one of your crewmates be eviscerated by an unseen foe. You quickly get dressed and start your detective work to try and see just what the hell is going on. Taking elements from Warp's prior work D, they would mix real-time gameplay with full motion video to bring you one of the most unique games on the system. Many of the game's areas would be pre-rendered, allowing you to explore and find items in cinematic style. Exiting these areas would put you in a real-time segment that allowed you to walk and run freely and explore. These real-time segments were also where the game's enemies would stalk you, invisible beasts that you can only track by sound. You have the ability to fight these enemies, but in true survival horror style, it behooves you to avoid conflict and try and get to the next area intact, as death comes swift in Enemy Zero. Graphically, this one is held up much better than D, with vastly superior full motion video sequences and real-time gameplay to break up the more cinematic areas. Enemy Zero has been going up in price the last few years, commanding nearly $100 at times. The far cheaper import version is playable, but you will need a walkthrough to help you understand the story and some of what's going on in the cinemas and video calls. Enemy Zero isn't the best horror game out there, but give it some time to grow on you, and I'm sure you'll find it as playable as I did. Lunacy, aka Torico, was released in late 1996 by Sega and developed by the same team that did the Mansion of Hidden Souls games. Less horror and more supernatural drama, Lunacy starts us out locked in a jail cell with no memory. A quick escape reveals a city with no exit, some asshole wanting to kill you, and a big secret you're supposed to find. This full motion video adventure game moves quickly and has multiple endings, making it easy to get into and replay. You'll explore Misty Town and try and uncover where you come from and why your memory is gone, finding clues to puzzles to open the way. Voice work here is pure 90s cheese and sucks as hard as you'd expect it to, but still retains that certain B-movie charm these games seem to have. Graphics are dark and the full motion video is grainy by today's standard, but you have to appreciate the speed at which everything moves. Most full motion video adventure games like this are unbearably slow, but Lunacy allows you to get around at breakneck speeds. Atmosphere is again front and center here, with the setting and music all playing a role in its appeal. More complex than usual puzzles also help Lunacy's staying power, and it'll take you a little while to see all that it has to offer. Unfortunately, the Western versions of this game have jumped up into the hundreds of dollars, and the import version isn't nearly as appealing due to its voice-heavy story.
My name is Fred. Fred, tell me about that crescent tattoo on your forehead.
Now, as you guys know, there are a lot more games on the Saturn that would fit into this particular category. Unfortunately, most of these games were Japan only. That means Japanese voice work, Japanese text, Japanese options, and a lot more effort to play them. I am willing to cover them if you guys have interest in it, however. Hit me up in the comment section below if you'd like to see me cover these Japanese-only horror-themed games. Also, I'm looking to do more Q&A sections in my videos, or maybe even dedicated Q&A videos. If you guys wouldn't mind, hit me up at segalordx@gmail.com. And as always, I greatly appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you next time.